Have you ever wondered who the man who walked barefoot for thousands of miles, carrying a cooking pot on his head, scattering apple seeds across the American Midwest, really was? Not a fairy tale character, not a crazy wanderer. He was a shrewd businessman, a profound missionary, and the man who quietly transformed the wilderness into apple orchards that feed millions. But behind his gentle smile and stories of kindness, even to mosquitoes flying into the fire, lies a life of loss, unwavering faith, and secrets that will make you exclaim, "Why didn't I know this before?" Today, we will follow in the barefoot footsteps of Johnny Appleseed, from an orphan boy in Massachusetts to a sower of hope on the wild frontier. Don't look away, because this story isn't just about apples. It's about kindness that can change a continent. Let's begin. Johnny Appleseed, the free appleseed sower across America. Imagine a crisp autumn day in the small colonial town of Leominster, Massachusetts, in the year 1774. The air carries the scent of falling leaves and wood smoke from chimneys, while the distant echoes of revolutionary fervor begin to stir across the province of Massachusetts Bay. On September 26th of that year, a boy named John Chapman was born, the second child of Nathaniel Chapman and his wife Elizabeth, who had married 4 years earlier on February 8th, 1770. John's birthplace was a modest home in what is now a quiet street renamed Johnny Appleseed Lane in his honor. A simple granite marker stands there today, commemorating the spot where one of America's most enduring folk heroes entered the world. But in 1774, he was just another infant in a turbulent time. The American colonies were on the brink of open rebellion against British rule. Battles like Lexington and Concord would erupt just months later, in April 1775, drawing ordinary men like John's father into the fight for independence. Nathaniel Chapman, John's father, was a wheelwright, carpenter, and farmer by trade, a practical man shaped by the demands of colonial life. Born on September 13, 1746, in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, Nathaniel had deep roots in New England. He was a Minuteman, one of those ready-to-fight patriots who could assemble at a minute's notice. Historical records show he served at the Battle of Concord and later in the Continental Army under General George Washington. His service during the Revolutionary War would profoundly influence the family's fortunes and, indirectly, the path young John would take. The Chapman family was not wealthy. Like many in rural Massachusetts, they lived simply, relying on the land for sustenance. John's older sister, Elizabeth, had been born in November 1770, making her 4 years his senior. The family grew quickly, or tried to. In June 1776, Elizabeth gave birth to a second son, named Nathaniel Jr., after his father. Tragically, the infant died just days later. Worse still, the mother, Elizabeth Simons Chapman, succumbed shortly after on July 18, 1776, to complications likely related to childbirth and possibly tuberculosis, a common killer of the era. John was not yet 2 years old when he lost his mother. The loss must have been devastating. With Nathaniel away serving in the war, young John and his sister Elizabeth were likely cared for by relatives, perhaps Elizabeth's parents, James and Anna Lawrence Simons. Records from the time are sparse, but speculation among historians suggests the maternal grandparents stepped in during this chaotic period. The war raged on, and Nathaniel's duties kept him from home for extended stretches. When he finally returned after the conflict's end, the family dynamics had shifted forever. In 1780, Nathaniel remarried. His new wife was Lucy Cooley from Longmeadow, Massachusetts, a picturesque town along the Connecticut River in the Springfield area. The marriage took place on July 24, 1780. Some sources cite 1781, and the couple settled in Longmeadow, where Lucy's widowed mother lived. This move marked a new chapter for the family. Nathaniel and Lucy would go on to have 10 children together, 5 boys and 5 girls, creating a large blended household. The half-siblings included Nathaniel Cooley Chapman, born December 1781, Abner, July 16, 1783, Pearlie, March 6, 1785, Lucy, July 21, 1787, Patty, February 26, 1790, Persis, November 15, 1793, Mary, January 19, 1796, Jonathan Cooley, February 2, 1798, Davis, April 25, 1800, and Sally, April 23, 1803. John, now living with this growing family, would have experienced the bustle of a crowded home filled with younger siblings. Long Meadow offered a more stable environment than wartime Leominster, with fertile river valley lands ideal for farming and hunting. Orchards perhaps planting the first seeds of John's lifelong fascination with trees and cultivation. Little is definitively known about John's formal education or daily childhood routines. Schools in rural Massachusetts were basic, often taught in one-room schoolhouses, emphasizing reading, writing, arithmetic, and the Bible. The Chapman household was pious and Christian, with the Bible as a central text. John developed a deep devotion to Scripture early on, a trait that would define his adult life as a missionary. He may have helped on the family farm, learning practical skills from his father carpentry, farming, and perhaps the basics of horticulture. Apples were already an important part of New England agriculture. Cider was a staple drink, safer than water in many cases, and orchards were common. As John grew into adolescence, the post-war economy in Massachusetts presented challenges. The Revolution had left many families in debt, with inflation and land disputes common. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787, a farmers' uprising in western Massachusetts, including areas near Long Meadow, highlighted the struggles of rural folk. Some historians speculate connections between Nathaniel Chapman, sometimes referred to as Captain Chapman, and these events, though evidence is inconclusive. The family's move to Long Meadow provided a backdrop of economic hardship. Mixed with opportunity, the Connecticut River Valley was fertile, and the promise of westward expansion beckoned. By his late teens, John showed signs of restlessness and independence. He was known for wandering alone in the woods, observing nature with a gentle curiosity. Stories from later years describe his unusual kindness toward animals, even as a boy. He may have avoided harming creatures, a habit rooted in emerging religious beliefs. Around 1792, at age 18, John persuaded his 11-year-old half-brother Nathaniel Cooley Chapman to join him in heading west. They left the crowded Long Meadow home behind, joining the stream of pioneers moving toward Pennsylvania and the Northwest Territory, future Ohio, Indiana, and beyond. This departure was not impulsive. The frontier offered land and opportunity, but it was harsh, untamed wilderness, conflicts with Native American tribes, and the need for self-sufficiency. John's early experiences in Massachusetts loss, family expansion, wartime echoes, and rural labor shaped a resilient, resourceful young man. He apprenticed briefly under an orchardist named Mr. Crawford, discovering a passion for apple trees. Apples, he learned, were more than fruit. Their seeds could transform wilderness into homesteads. In the frontier, a man with 50 apple trees could claim land rights, and cider provided a vital, safe beverage. John's childhood was marked by profound loss and adaptation. Orphaned young, raised in a large blended family, and influenced by the spirit of revolution and piety, he carried forward a quiet determination. He was no ordinary wanderer. He was preparing, unknowingly at first, to become a legend, the barefoot nurseryman who would spread apple trees across the American Midwest, not for personal gain alone, but as a symbol of hope, provision, and kindness. As John stepped westward in 1792, the seeds of his future were already sown. The boy from Leominster, who had known grief early and family love abundantly, was about to plant something far greater than orchards. He would plant a legacy that endures to this day. By the early 1790s, the American frontier was calling. The Revolutionary War had ended a decade earlier, and the young United States was expanding westward. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had organized the vast territory north of the Ohio River into future states, promising land to settlers willing to tame the wilderness. For many in crowded New England, the promise of cheap, fertile land was irresistible. John Chapman, now 18 years old, felt that pull more strongly than most. In 1792, John made the decisive move. He convinced his 11-year-old half-brother, Nathaniel Cooley Chapman, to join him on the journey west. Leaving behind the familiar Connecticut River valley of Long Meadow, the two brothers set out on foot, carrying little more than a few belongings, some tools, and the determination to build a new life. Their destination was not yet clear, perhaps western Pennsylvania, perhaps the Ohio country, but the direction was unmistakable, toward the setting sun. The journey itself was arduous. In the 1790s, there were no railroads, no canals, and only the crudest roads in many places. Travelers followed old Indian trails, military roads left over from the French and Indian War, or the newly blazed paths of pioneers. The brothers likely traveled along the Mohawk Valley route or followed the Susquehanna River southward before turning west. They walked for weeks, sleeping under the stars or in the occasional barn, trading labor for food when possible. John, already tall and strong from farm work, carried the heavier load, while young Nathaniel kept pace as best he could. They eventually reached the upper reaches of the Allegheny Plateau in western Pennsylvania. Here, the land began to open up rolling hills, dense hardwood forests, and clear, fast-running streams. It was a place of both beauty and danger. Bears, wolves, rattlesnakes, and occasional hostile encounters with Native American groups still defending their territory. Yet it was also a place of opportunity. Land was abundant and inexpensive, often available for pennies an acre if one could improve it. John and Nathaniel settled for a time near the town of Warren, in what is now Warren County, Pennsylvania, along Broken Straw Creek. It was here, around 1798 to 1800, that John planted his first apple nursery. This was not the random scattering of seeds that popular legend would later describe. John was methodical. He had learned from orchardists back in Massachusetts that apple trees grown from seed produced fruit that was usually tart and unsuitable for eating. Fresh but perfect for making hard cider, the frontier's most reliable beverage. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, water was often unsafe to drink. Rivers and streams carried bacteria, and wells could become contaminated. Hard cider, fermented from apples, was alcoholic enough to kill most pathogens and provided calories, vitamins, and a sense of well-being. Nearly every frontier family kept barrels of cider in the cellar. A man who could supply young apple trees was providing more than fruit. He was providing security, health, and hospitality. John understood this market perfectly. He began collecting apple seeds from cider mills in eastern Pennsylvania and New York. After cider was pressed, the leftover pumice pulp, skins, and seeds was often discarded. John would ask for the pumice, carefully separating the seeds. He dried them, stored them in sacks, and transported them westward. At Broken Straw Creek, John selected a favorable piece of land flat, well-drained, with good sunlight. He cleared the underbrush, built simple fences to keep out deer and livestock, and planted rows of apple seedlings in carefully prepared beds. These were not orchards for himself. They were nurseries places where young trees were grown to be sold or traded to incoming settlers. This first nursery was modest, but it established the pattern John would follow for the next 4 decades. He would arrive in a region ahead of the main wave of settlement, identify good land, clear it, plant seedlings, and protect them until they were sturdy enough to transplant. Then, when families arrived looking for homesteads, John would be ready with young trees for sale or barter. Around 1800, John and Nathaniel moved farther west, into the Muskingum River Valley in what is now east-central Ohio. The Northwest Territory had become Ohio in 1803, and settlement was accelerating. The brothers helped clear land, built cabins, and planted more nurseries. Nathaniel eventually settled down in the area, marrying and raising a family, but John could not stay in one place for long. The frontier kept moving, and so did he. By 1806, John had developed a more efficient method of transport. Instead of carrying seeds on his back, he built 2 dugout canoes, lashed them together catamaran style, and loaded them with sacks of seeds. He floated down the Ohio River, then up the Muskingum and Walhonding tributaries, stopping at promising sites along the way. At each landing, he would establish a new nursery, fence it, and leave it in the care of a local farmer or squatter, promising to return. John's business model was simple but brilliant. He rarely sold trees for cash. Instead, he accepted barter food, clothing, tools, or a place to sleep. Sometimes he took promissory notes, payable when the settlers' crops came in. He also understood frontier land law. Under various land acts, a settler could claim title to land by improving it, building a cabin, clearing fields, and planting fruit trees. 50 apple trees were often sufficient to demonstrate improvement. John's nurseries gave settlers a head start on that requirement. As the years passed, John became a familiar figure along the frontier. He walked barefoot, even in winter, believing that shoes were unnecessary and perhaps a luxury he could do without. His clothing was patched and ragged, often consisting of whatever settlers had discarded. He carried a cooking pot on his head as a hat of practical choice that protected him from sun and rain and doubled as a cooking vessel. He ate simply cornmeal mush, cold meat, berries, nuts, and whatever he could forage. He avoided harming animals whenever possible, even refusing to kill rattlesnakes unless they posed an immediate threat. Stories began to circulate about the strange, gentle nurseryman. One tale, recorded years later, described John extinguishing his campfire because mosquitoes were flying into the flames and dying. "God forbid that I should build a fire for my comfort that should be the means of destroying any of his creatures," he reportedly said. Another story told of John trading his hat for a Bible when he met a settler who had none. Still another described him sleeping outside so that a mother bear and her cubs could take shelter in a cave he had intended to use. These anecdotes, while sometimes embellished over time, reflect a core truth about John Chapman. He was deeply religious, compassionate, and committed to living in harmony with nature. His faith was not the conventional Protestantism of most frontier families. Around 1800, John had encountered the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, the 18th century Swedish theologian, whose writings formed the basis of the new church, or Swedenborgian denomination. Swedenborg taught that the spiritual world and the natural world were intimately connected, that heaven and hell were states of mind as much as places, and that true religion consisted of love to God and charity to one's neighbor. John embraced these ideas passionately. He carried Swedenborg's books with him, reading aloud to settlers in the evenings. He saw his work planting apple trees as a form of charity, providing for the physical needs of families while spreading spiritual truth. By the 1810s, John had nurseries scattered across hundreds of miles, from the Allegheny River in Pennsylvania to the White River in central Indiana. He walked constantly, visiting each site every year or two, pruning, grafting, and selling trees. He became known simply as Johnny Appleseed, a nickname that reflected both affection and the simplicity of his appearance. Yet John was no aimless wanderer. He was a businessman with a vision. He bought and sold land, always staying ahead of the surveyors and speculators. When he died in 1845, he owned over 1,200 acres in 3 states' property he had acquired cheaply and improved with nurseries. He lived in poverty by choice, but he died a landowner of considerable holdings. The journey that began in 1792 with 2 brothers walking west had grown into something much larger. John Chapman was no longer just a young man seeking opportunity. He had become a pioneer of a different kind, not a conqueror of the wilderness, but a nurturer of it. With every seed he planted, every tree he sold, he was helping to build the American Midwest, one orchard at a time. And the frontier kept moving. So did Johnny Appleseed. As the first decade of the 19th century gave way to the second, John Chapman, now widely known as Johnny Appleseed, had transformed from a young wanderer into a distinctive figure on the American frontier. He was no longer merely following the wave of settlement. He was anticipating it, moving ahead like a scout who plants the first rows of corn before the wagons arrive. Between 1810 and 1845, Johnny Appleseed's range of travel expanded dramatically. His nurseries dotted the landscape from the upper Allegheny River in western Pennsylvania, through the valleys of eastern and central Ohio, into the Whitewater and Wabash regions of Indiana, and even as far west as the Illinois prairies and the upper reaches of the Maumee River. Some historians believe he may have crossed into what is now southern Michigan and northern Kentucky, though the core of his activity remained in the 3 states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. He walked, always walked. Horses were expensive and required feed. Boats were useful only on rivers. On foot, he could go anywhere the trails led. He covered hundreds, perhaps thousands, of miles each year, following Indian paths, military roads, and the faint traces left by earlier travelers. He moved in a loose, irregular circuit, returning to each nursery every 1 to 3 years to prune, graft, sell trees, and collect payment. His appearance became legendary. He rarely wore shoes, even in the snows of Ohio winters or the thorny underbrush of Indiana. When asked why, he sometimes replied that shoes were a needless luxury, or that he wanted to toughen his feet as nature intended. More often, he simply smiled and changed the subject. His clothing was a patchwork of whatever settlers had given him: cast-off shirts, torn trousers, pieces of blanket sewn together. He carried almost nothing a small sack for seeds, a few tools, a Bible, and Swedenborg's theological writings. On his head sat his most famous accessory, a tin cooking pot, which he wore as a hat during the day and used to boil his simple meals at night. His diet was austere. He ate cold cornmeal mush, dried meat when he could get it, berries and nuts in season, and the occasional gift of bread or stew from grateful families. He was largely vegetarian in later years, influenced by Swedenborgian teachings that emphasized compassion for all living things. He avoided killing animals for food and was known to purchase worn-out horses or oxen from cruel owners, nurse them back to health, and then set them free. Yet beneath this eccentric exterior lay a remarkably shrewd businessman. Johnny Appleseed was not a pauper by accident. He was a pauper by choice. He understood the economics of the frontier better than most settlers did. When he arrived in a region that was still sparsely populated, he would select a tract of land, often along a river or creek, for easy access that he believed would soon attract settlers. He would clear a small area, build a simple rail fence to keep out deer and hogs, and plant thousands of apple seedlings. These nurseries required minimal labor after the initial planting, but they grew valuable over time. When the first wave of families arrived, usually within 2 to 5 years, Johnny was ready. He offered young trees for sale at prices ranging from 2 to 6 cents each, depending on size and location. Few settlers had cash. Most paid in barter: corn, potatoes, pork, homespun cloth, tools, or a promise to pay later. Johnny kept meticulous mental accounts. He rarely wrote anything down and collected what was owed when he returned on his next circuit. He also understood the intricacies of frontier land law. Under the various land acts of the early republic, particularly the acts of 1820 and 1830, a settler could gain title to land by improving it. One of the easiest and most visible improvements was planting an orchard. 50 bearing apple trees were often sufficient to prove cultivation and secure a preemption claim. Johnny's nurseries gave incoming settlers an immediate advantage. They could purchase ready-grown trees and meet the improvement requirement years faster than if they started from seed. In some cases, Johnny himself filed claims on promising land, planted nurseries, and then sold the improved property at a modest profit. When he died in March 1845, probate records showed that he owned more than 1,200 acres across 3 states, holdings worth thousands of dollars at the time. Most of this land was acquired cheaply in the 1810s and 1820s, improved with orchards, and held until settlers were willing to pay higher prices. He was, in modern terms, a real estate speculator who used apple trees as his primary capital improvement. Despite his growing wealth on paper, Johnny continued to live in extreme simplicity. He slept outdoors or in settlers' barns, never built himself a permanent cabin, and wore the same ragged clothes year after year. When people asked why he did not settle down and enjoy his prosperity, he often answered with a gentle smile, "I am planting for others. My reward is in heaven." His Swedenborgian faith was the true center of his life. Emanuel Swedenborg's writings taught that the material world was a reflection of the spiritual, that acts of usefulness and charity were the highest forms of worship, and that heaven was a place of ever-increasing usefulness. Johnny took these teachings literally. Planting apple trees was not merely a business. It was a religious duty, a way of making the wilderness useful to humankind, and, by extension, serving God. He carried small volumes of Swedenborg's works, often handwritten copies he had made himself, and read them aloud to families in the evenings. He preached informally, not as a minister with a pulpit, but as a friend sharing truth around a campfire. He spoke of the spiritual sense of Scripture, of the importance of love and charity, and of the coming New Jerusalem on earth. Many settlers welcomed these quiet talks. Frontier life was lonely, and a visitor who brought both trees and spiritual comfort was doubly welcome. His compassion extended to animals and even insects. One of the most repeated stories recorded in several independent sources describes a night when Johnny built a fire to warm himself, only to notice mosquitoes flying into the flames and perishing. He immediately extinguished the fire, saying, "God forbid that I should build a fire for my comfort that should cause the death of any of his creatures." On another occasion, he gave up a cave shelter to a mother bear and her cubs, preferring to sleep in the open rather than disturb them. These acts were not mere eccentricity. They were consistent with Swedenborg's doctrine of the interconnectedness of all creation and the duty to avoid unnecessary harm. Johnny believed that cruelty to animals hardened the human heart and made spiritual progress more difficult. His gentle treatment of horses, oxen, and even snakes — he once relocated a rattlesnake rather than kill it — earned him the reputation of a saintly figure among many frontier families. By the 1830s, Johnny's legend was already growing. Settlers told stories of the barefoot man with a tin pot hat who appeared just when they needed fruit trees most. Children ran to greet him. Women offered him food. Men respected his knowledge of land and weather. He never asked for special treatment, but he rarely left a homestead empty-handed, yet he remained solitary. He never married, believing, according to Swedenborg, that true conjugal love was spiritual and would be fulfilled in heaven. He had no permanent home, no possessions beyond what he carried, and no desire for worldly recognition. His life was one long act of usefulness: planting, walking, teaching, giving. As the 1840s dawned, The frontier he had helped tame was changing. Steamboats plied the rivers, canals linked the Great Lakes to the Ohio, and railroads were being discussed. The wilderness was giving way to farms, towns, and counties. Johnny, now in his late 60s, began to slow down. He spent more time in the Fort Wayne area of northern Indiana, where he maintained his last large nursery of about 15,000 trees on 42 acres. But he still walked, he still planted, and he still carried the same tin pot, the same gentle smile, and the same unshakable faith that usefulness was the highest calling. The wandering life of Johnny Appleseed was not over yet, but the wilderness he had loved was drawing to a close, and with it, the era of the solitary nurseryman who had helped make the American Midwest fruitful. By the early 1800s, John Chapman Johnny Appleseed had already become more than a nurseryman wandering the frontier. Beneath the ragged clothes, the tin pot hat, and the barefoot footsteps lay a profound spiritual conviction that gave purpose to every mile he walked and every seed he planted. At the heart of his life was not profit, not even the satisfaction of seeing orchards bloom, but a deep and abiding faith rooted in the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg. Swedenborg's influence on Johnny was not casual or superficial. It was transformative, shaping his worldview, his daily habits, and his relationships with both people and the natural world. To understand Johnny Appleseed the man, one must first understand the theology that guided him. Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688 to 1772, was no ordinary religious figure. Born into a prominent Swedish family, he began his career as a brilliant scientist and engineer, publishing works on mining, anatomy, cosmology, and mathematics. He corresponded with the leading minds of the Enlightenment and served on the Swedish Board of Mines. Yet, in his 56th year, Swedenborg underwent a series of intense spiritual experiences that changed the course of his life. He claimed that the Lord Jesus Christ appeared to him and commissioned him to reveal the inner meaning of the Bible and to describe the true nature of the spiritual world. Over the remaining 28 years of his life, Swedenborg produced an extraordinary body of theological writing, more than 30 major works, many of them massive in scope. The most important include Heaven and Hell, 1758, Divine Love and Wisdom, 1763, Divine Providence, 1764, and the multi-volume Arcana Coelestia, Secrets of Heaven, an allegorical commentary on Genesis and Exodus. Swedenborg rejected several core doctrines of traditional Christianity. He denied the Trinity as three separate persons, teaching instead that God is one divine person in whom the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit exist as aspects of a single being. He rejected the idea of vicarious atonement, Christ dying to pay for humanity's sins and original sin, arguing that each person is responsible for his or her own spiritual state. Heaven and hell, he taught, are not arbitrary rewards or punishments, but natural consequences of the choices people make in life. Those who love God and serve others enter heaven. Those who love only themselves and dominate others enter hell by their own free choice. Central to Swedenborg's theology is the concept of use or usefulness. Every created thing, angel, human, animal, plant, exists for a purpose, and the highest joy comes from performing useful service to others. Heaven, he wrote, is a kingdom of mutual usefulness, where every soul finds fulfillment in contributing to the common good. This doctrine of usefulness became the guiding principle of Johnny Appleseed's life. Johnny first encountered Swedenborg's teachings sometime around 1800, likely through a traveling preacher or a copy of one of the theologian's books circulating in frontier settlements. The exact moment is unknown, but the impact was immediate and lifelong. He began carrying small volumes of Swedenborg's writings, often handwritten, excerpts he copied himself, and reading them aloud to families he visited. He became, in effect, an itinerant lay missionary of the new church, the name Swedenborgians gave to the spiritual community inspired by his revelations. Johnny's evangelism was gentle and unforced. He did not demand conversion or condemn those who disagreed with him. Instead, he shared passages about love, charity, and the spiritual meaning of Scripture, often tying them to everyday frontier concerns. He spoke of how God's love is present in every useful thing, how planting a tree that feeds a family is itself an act of worship. Many settlers, living in isolation and hardship, welcomed these quiet evenings of reading and conversation. Johnny's presence brought not only young apple trees, but also comfort, hope, and a sense of connection to something larger. His faith also shaped his personal habits in striking ways. Swedenborg taught that unnecessary cruelty hardens the heart and distances one from heaven. Johnny took this teaching to heart. He became a vegetarian in his later years, avoiding meat entirely. He refused to kill animals for food and was known to buy old or injured horses from cruel owners, nurse them back to health, and then set them free to live out their days in peace. One of the most famous anecdotes illustrates this compassion vividly. On a cold night in the wilderness, Johnny built a fire to warm himself. As he sat, he noticed mosquitoes flying into the flames and dying. Disturbed, he immediately extinguished the fire, saying, according to accounts passed down by those who knew him, God forbid that I should build a fire for my comfort, which should be the means of destroying any of his creatures. Another story tells of Johnny giving up a cave he intended to use for shelter, because a mother bear and her cubs had taken refuge there first. Rather than drive them out, he slept in the open air. These acts were not mere quirks. They reflected Swedenborg's teaching that all life is interconnected and that every creature has its place in the divine order. Johnny believed that harming even the smallest creature without necessity would create spiritual disorder within himself. His gentleness extended to plants as well. He was careful when pruning, always aiming to promote healthy growth rather than simply maximize yield. Johnny's faith also influenced his views on marriage and family. Swedenborg wrote extensively about conjugal love, describing it as the highest form of human love when it is grounded in spiritual union. Johnny, however, never married. Some accounts suggest he believed his true conjugal partner awaited him in the spiritual world, a notion drawn from Swedenborg's teachings about eternal unions formed in heaven. Others speculate that his wandering life and poverty simply made marriage impractical. Whatever the reason, he lived as a solitary man, finding companionship in the families he served and the spiritual community he carried within. Despite his unconventional lifestyle, Johnny was deeply respected by most who met him. Settlers knew him as honest, generous, and reliable. He never cheated in trade, always honored his promises, and often gave trees to families too poor to pay. When he returned to a nursery after several years, he would carefully account for every tree sold or bartered, even if the settler had long forgotten the debt. His Swedenborgian beliefs also gave him a sense of optimism about the future. Swedenborg taught that the world was entering a new spiritual era, the New Jerusalem, in which true Christianity would be restored through inner understanding rather than external ritual. Johnny saw his work as part of this renewal. By planting orchards that sustained families, he was helping to build a society based on usefulness and charity. By sharing Swedenborg's writings, he was planting spiritual seeds alongside the physical ones. As the decades passed, Johnny's reputation as a holy man grew. Some called him a saint, others simply a good, strange man. Children ran to greet him when he appeared on the trail. Women prepared extra food for him. Men sought his advice about land, weather, and planting. He never sought fame, yet fame found him. By the 1830s and early 1840s, however, the frontier was changing. The wilderness that had once stretched endlessly was being fenced, plowed, and settled. Steamboats, canals, and early railroads were shrinking distances. The solitary nurserymen who had walked ahead of civilization now found himself walking through a landscape that was catching up. Yet even in his later years, Johnny remained faithful to his calling. He continued to tend his nurseries, especially the large one near Fort Wayne, Indiana, where he maintained about 15,000 trees on 42 acres. He still walked the trails, still carried his tin pot hat, still read from Swedenborg by firelight, and still planted trees for those who would come after him. His faith had sustained him through decades of hardship, solitude, and physical toil. It had given meaning to a life that, by worldly standards, might have seemed poor and eccentric. For Johnny Appleseed, the greatest wealth was usefulness, to God, to humanity, and to the land itself. And so he walked on, barefoot and gentle, carrying the light of Swedenborg's teachings and the promise of apple blossoms yet to come. By the mid-1830s, the American frontier that Johnny Appleseed had helped shape was no longer the wild, untamed expanse he had first known. Settlements had grown into villages, villages into towns, and towns into counties with courthouses, schools, and churches. The great rivers now carried steamboats loaded with passengers and goods. Canals connected the Great Lakes to the Ohio River system, and whispers of railroads began to echo across the Midwest. The era of the solitary frontiersman was slowly drawing to a close. Yet Johnny Appleseed continued his quiet, persistent work. In his later years, Johnny spent more time in northern Indiana, particularly around Fort Wayne, which had become a growing hub after the completion of the Wabash and Erie Canal in the 1830s. He maintained his largest and most productive nursery there, approximately 42 acres, with an estimated 15,000 apple trees. This land, situated along the St. Joseph River, served as a kind of headquarters, though Johnny never built himself a permanent home. He still preferred to sleep in barns, under the stars, or in the homes of grateful settlers who welcomed him. Even as age slowed his pace, Johnny remained active. He walked his familiar circuits, checking on older nurseries in Ohio and Pennsylvania, grafting new varieties onto hardy rootstock, and selling or bartering trees to newer arrivals. His appearance had changed little over the decades. The same ragged clothing, the same tin pot hat, the same barefoot stride. Only the lines on his face and the slight stoop in his shoulders betrayed the passage of time. He was approaching 70 in advanced age for a man who had lived so roughly and traveled so far. Despite the physical toll, his spirit remained gentle and generous. Stories from this period describe him giving trees to poor families without expectation of payment, repairing fences around neglected nurseries at his own expense, and continuing to read from Swedenborg's writings to anyone willing to listen. His reputation as a holy, almost saintly figure had grown. Children in frontier schools were taught about the good man with the tin hat who planted apple trees for everyone. Settlers spoke of him with affection and awe, often embellishing tales of his kindness and eccentricity. One recurring anecdote from his later years tells of Johnny encountering a settler who had fallen on hard times. The man had no money to buy trees, but Johnny handed him a dozen saplings anyway, saying simply, "Plant them, and when they bear fruit, remember the Lord." Such acts of uncalculated generosity were common. He rarely kept records of debts owed to him, trusting that Providence would provide. By 1845, Johnny was in his early 70s and showing signs of frailty. Friends in the Fort Wayne area, particularly the Worth family, with whom he often stayed, urged him to rest more, but he refused. He believed his work was not yet finished. In early March of that year, he set out on what would be his final journey. He walked to several nearby settlements, checking on trees and visiting families. On March 18, 1845, he stopped at the home of William Worth, a friend and fellow Swedenborgian, near the present-day Johnny Appleseed Park in Fort Wayne. According to accounts preserved by Worth's family and later recorded by biographers, Johnny arrived in good spirits. He spent the evening talking with Worth about spiritual matters and the progress of the new church. The next morning, he felt unwell, but insisted on walking into town to speak with a neighbor. He collapsed on the street from what was likely pneumonia or a severe respiratory illness, common killers in an era before antibiotics. Friends carried him back to the Worth home, where he lingered for a short time. He died peacefully on March 18, 1845, at approximately 70 years of age. The exact location of his grave has been the subject of debate for more than a century. Local tradition claims he was buried near the St. Joseph River in what is now Johnny Appleseed Park, Fort Wayne. A granite marker and a small memorial stand there today, maintained by the city and visited by thousands each year. Some historians argue he may have been buried on a nearby farm or in an unmarked plot, as was common for itinerant men of modest means. Regardless, the Fort Wayne site has become the symbolic resting place, a place where people still leave apples and thank you notes. When Johnny died, his estate was surprisingly substantial for a man who had lived in poverty. Probate records show he owned more than 1,200 acres of land across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana property he had acquired over decades at low frontier prices and improved with orchards. Much of this land was sold at auction during the financial panic of 1837 and its aftermath, leaving only a modest inheritance for his sister Persis and other relatives. The contrast between his material wealth and his chosen simplicity became part of the legend. A man rich in land who chose to live as if he owned nothing. In the decades following his death, Johnny Appleseed's story grew far beyond the frontier communities that had known him personally. The first major published account appeared in 1871 in Harper's New Monthly magazine, written by journalist W.D. Haley. Haley interviewed elderly settlers who had known Johnny and collected their memories, many already tinged with myth. He described the tin pot hat, the barefoot wanderings, the gentle treatment of animals, and the endless planting of apple trees. The article struck a chord with post-Civil War America, a nation eager for symbols of innocence, generosity, and pioneer spirit. In 1875, poet Lydia Maria Child immortalized Johnny in verse with Appleseed John, a children's poem that romanticized him as a kindly wanderer scattering seeds of hope. The poem was widely reprinted and recited in schools. In the early 20th century, folklorists and storytellers added further layers. The most influential popularization came in 1948 with Walt Disney's animated short film Johnny Appleseed, part of the feature Melody Time. The Disney version portrayed Johnny as a cheerful, singing pioneer accompanied by his guardian angel, Little Orny. Though highly fictionalized, the film introduced Johnny Appleseed to millions of children and cemented his place in American popular culture. Over time, the legend diverged from the historical reality. The image of Johnny scattering seeds randomly as he walked became the dominant story, overshadowing the truth that he was a careful nurseryman who planned his plantings strategically. The idea that he planted sweet-eating apples replaced the historical fact that most of his trees produced tart fruit for cider. Yet the core of the legend remained true. A man who lived simply, gave generously, and helped make the wilderness fruitful for others. Today, Johnny Appleseed is commemorated in dozens of ways. Festivals are held annually in Fort Wayne and other Midwestern towns. Highways and parks bear his name. Schools teach children about his life as an example of kindness and stewardship. Historians continue to research his roots, his land holdings, and his Swedenborgian faith, uncovering new details about a man who left surprisingly few written records. What endures most powerfully is the symbol Johnny Appleseed represents. He stands for the quiet heroism of ordinary people who contribute to the common good without seeking recognition. He reminds us that usefulness planting for those who come after is one of the highest forms of human endeavor. His life illustrates that real wealth lies not in possessions, but in service. that gentleness can coexist with strength, and that one person, working patiently over decades, can leave a living legacy. The apple trees that still grow across the Midwest, some, descended from the very orchards he planted, are his most enduring monument. Each spring, when blossoms cover the branches, and each autumn, when fruit ripens, the land remembers Johnny Appleseed. He walked ahead of civilization, not to conquer it, but to nurture it. He carried no sword, only seeds. And those seeds grew into something far greater than he could have imagined. In the end, Johnny Appleseed's story is not about apples alone. It is about hope, charity, faith, and the quiet power of a life lived for others. It is a reminder that even in the hardest places, one determined soul can help make the world more fruitful, more beautiful, and more kind. And so the barefoot nurseryman, with his tin pot hat and gentle heart, continues to walk through the American imagination planting seeds that still bloom, generation after generation. When Johnny Appleseed drew his last breath on that quiet March morning in 1845, the wilderness he had loved so deeply did not weep aloud. No trumpets sounded, no crowds gathered. Only a handful of friends carried his tired body to a simple resting place near the gentle flow of the St. Joseph River. They laid him down without fanfare, perhaps beneath an apple tree he himself had once planted, and the earth received him as it had received every seed he had ever placed in its care. In that moment, the man who had walked thousands of miles barefoot, who had worn a tin pot as a crown, and given away more than he ever kept, slipped away as softly as twilight. Yet something in the air felt different. The wind that rustled through the young leaves seemed to carry a whisper. A life of pure usefulness had just ended, and the world was poorer for it and richer, too. He left behind no wife to mourn him, no children to carry his name, no grand house to mark his passing. But he left behind something far more enduring. Rows upon rows of apple trees stretching across 3 states, blossoms waiting to open, fruit waiting to ripen, shade waiting to shelter generations he would never meet. Those trees were not monuments of stone or gold. They were living promises that someone once cared enough to plant for strangers, to give without asking for anything in return. In the years that followed, the story of Johnny Appleseed began to bloom in the hearts of a nation still healing from war and dreaming of new beginnings. The words of journalists, poets, and storytellers carried his name across the land like seeds on the wind. Children in schoolrooms far from the frontier learned to recite Lydia Maria Child's tender lines, their young voices filling classrooms with wonder. And in 1948, when Disney's gentle animation brought him to life singing, smiling, scattering seeds beneath a sky full of stars, millions of children across America felt their hearts stir. They didn't know the full truth of the man who had lived so simply, who had slept under the stars so others could have fruit, who had chosen poverty so the land could grow rich. But they felt the warmth of his kindness. They felt the quiet power of a life lived for others. Even now, more than 180 years later, something happens every spring across the American Midwest. The apple trees awaken. Pink and white blossoms cover the branches like soft snow. The air fills with sweetness. Families walk beneath those boughs. Children reach up to touch the petals. Lovers stand hand in hand. And somewhere in the rustle of leaves, you can almost hear his footsteps slow, steady, barefoot, still walking ahead, still planting for tomorrow. Those trees are his voice. They speak without words. I was here. I cared. I gave what I had so you could have more. In a world that so often measures success by wealth, fame, and speed, Johnny Appleseed stands as a quiet rebuke and a tender invitation. He reminds us that the greatest lives are not the loudest, but the most useful. That true richness is measured not in what we take, but in what we leave behind for others. That one person armed only with faith, a handful of seeds, and an unbreakable heart can change the face of a continent, one small, patient act at a time. So the next time you bite into an apple, pause for a moment. Taste not just the fruit, but the story it carries. The story of a solitary man who walked through wilderness with nothing but hope in his pockets and love in his hands. A man who believed that every seed planted was a prayer answered. Every tree that grew was a hug given across time. Johnny Appleseed never sought to be remembered, yet the land itself refuses to forget him. Every blossom in spring is his smile. Every ripe fruit in autumn is his gift. Every shaded path beneath the branches is his gentle embrace. And somewhere, deep in the soul of America, his quiet footsteps still echo soft, steady, forever moving forward, forever planting, forever reminding us, one heart full of kindness can make the whole world bloom. If this story touches your heart, if you feel warmth because a man chose to live his life sowing hope for others, then please do one small thing for yourself and for us. Subscribe to the channel now. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because every week we will together recount the forgotten stories of ordinary people who have done extraordinary things. Farmers, mothers, soldiers, wanderers with big hearts. They don't appear in the newspapers. They don't have monuments, but they are the backbone of this country, of humanity. Subscribing to the channel is your way of telling them, I am still listening. I still believe in kindness. I will not let stories like these die. Let's keep the flame alive together. Let's sow the most beautiful seeds of emotion together. Subscribe today, because Johnny Appleseed planted trees for us. Now it's our turn to plant hope for each other. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart. See you in the next story.